Hello, people. This week I read, this is technically called The Last Lion. It's a 3-part biography of Winston Churchill. And, so first part's called Visions of Glory. So I suppose you could call it The Last Lion, or Visions of Glory, or The Last Lion Part 1. However, I guess you want to chop that up. It's 1874 to 1932. And it could, you think it's 3 books. Each of the books could be like 4 different books on their own. Legitimately. This is how interesting a life Winston Churchill led. I 100% recommend not just this one, the whole trilogy. Obviously, it's a biography. You can pick it up at any time, essentially. Any one of the 3 you could read and be just fine. It's extremely historical. And in more ways than one. We'll get into it. And it's by William Manchester, who is also fantastic. So you got a lot of positives here. I mean, will it be expensive? As books go, yeah, it's kind of expensive. But, now, you don't say this much in reading because it's entertainment. But the sort of the value you get out of it is fairly high. On top of being entertaining, Winston Churchill is funny. Our author's funny. Funny things happen, interesting things. It's also, you can read it with the assurance of a history. The William Manchester is a historian. So you can take anything you read out of this almost to the bank and carry that knowledge with you. So if he mentions such and such about England or about the war or whatever he mentions, you can rest assured that it's true. And so value-wise, it's fairly high up there. We start now. I got this on audiobook. And so what happens, and I personally, as someone who loves books, love this. There aren't sound effects, this kind of thing, but our narrator, our speaker, does a different voice for the author. And these are words written that the author is writing. But what will end up happening is, because we have a lot of personal information from Winston Churchill, I can be mid-sentence and cut into actual quotes from Winston Churchill related to the sentence. And that's what our author does. He'll cut right in, and then it's Winston Churchill speaking, and then we come out of it. And what our speaker will do is be in the author's voice, then cut into one of multiple voices. Because this book starts at, he's like 10. So he'll do a real kid voice. And at first you might think this is odd. You get used to it very quickly. He'll slightly change it for a teenager Winston. And then he'll change it again for young man Winston Churchill. And we have a lot of audio. We have a lot of audio of Winston Churchill. We know what he sounds like. That sort of cadence, he carries through the whole book. And it starts to be very, very enjoyable. Now, I think by the 3rd book, we drop that a little bit. Or I think we changed narrators. We changed speakers, readers, actual readers. And I'm slightly disappointed in that. I really loved his voice throughout. But what can you do? So you have to know that. Again, if you're a fan of audiobooks and that's a no-go, completely understandable. You'll pick it up, I'm assuming, when you read the physical book because of quotation marks, etc., etc. But even if you're not a fan, I might consider this one as a try. It's really that good. It really is. So this is what I say about like multiple histories at once. Our author will give you everything you need going in. You don't need anything. So he's born in 1874. He's born in Queen Victoria's England, the Victorian age. And we get a small, almost mini biography of that age just to understand the world this person's born into. He is an aristocrat. So we get like 2 months in, his mom stops dealing with him essentially, hands him off to a nanny. And this is, described as normal. But you can, through one person, I'm sort of getting to live through day to day the Victorian age. This is the nanny. What is it? Miss Everest, his nanny. Loves this lady. And it's her basically until he's like 10 and goes to school. Maybe a little after. And she just raises him. She's teaching him things about life, about what to do, about how to act. And once a week, maybe, he presents himself to his parents and they look over him and they ask him questions and they talk to him. Business-like. And his parents didn't even always do that. And from our perspective, that's just like, it's almost bad parenting. But this was the standard then. And to know that that's not seen as abnormal, very fun, very interesting. We also get, and this is another interesting thing about Winston Churchill himself. In the 1800s, they were big into letter writing. I think Robert E. Lee was the same. You made a point to consistently, probably maybe once a week or more, write to your people. Lee would write to his mom writes back and forth. So this isn't unusual either. It's very cool to see in practice, because here is 10-year-old Winston Churchill, and we have the letters. I don't know how many thousands of his letters survived. We have the letters, and it's 10-year-old. Can you imagine being 10 and you're writing your mom letters about school, about how this isn't working for me, etc. And she's writing back like, stick with it, don't quit. This is the interactions he has with his mom. And some of it gets into 10-year-old arguments like, this is unfair, and etc., etc. And mom's like, I'm not reading that because you're not talking to me right. Really, it's really, really fun to watch. And I just sit there and think, because you hear a lot of sort of the trouble with social media, the trouble with texting all the time. And I'm like, it's just communication. It's just one of the most natural things people do. And the speed of it doesn't change anything. The fact that I can text people and get instant responses and they're across the country doesn't change the impact, which is the crucial point. His letters to his mom, his letters to his wife, etc., are as impactful as those texts can be to our youth who overblow it, or whatever people say about it, just negative. There's no change to me. There's no change when the telephone was invented. There's no change when the cell phone's invented. It's our interest in communication. So that I have letters from the 1800s from a guy born before there were streetlights, and you hear in the letter the emotions coming out across these two people. It's very, very cool. His father, Randolph, is in Parliament, and he goes first to, what is this? St. George's School. He goes to St. George's, but the headmaster's, it's the 1800s, and he's a taskmaster. Maybe a little bit, maybe a little bit too much. And he complains to his mom for a couple of years that this isn't working. And one day he comes home, and the nanny sees all these, like whelp marks on his back because the guy was beating on him. And then his mom sees it, and then, we pull him out of that school. and then he gets to another school. But what we start with that never ends is this issue he had with education. It's so funny. It really is. It is very much Winston Churchill's personality. He'll walk up to a test at 12 or 15 or any age with extreme confidence, strutting in, and then fail horribly on the test. I'm just use a few quotes. Okay, one. This is Winston Churchill writing a letter, young Winston Churchill. Isn't it wonderful that water is made up of hydrogen and nitrogen? And it's an example of the author and what I mean. The author says about this, isn't it wonderful that water is made up of hydrogen and nitrogen? The author says he's not dyslexic. And then the author says, nor is he as stupid as he seemed. And you might think, like, I don't need my author interjecting that much opinion. One, it's funny. It's funny as all get out. Why not? But two, it's also not a textbook. It's a biography by this author. And so as you read, it comes across weirdly like, I don't know, like we're at a club, a lounge or something, just chatting. And I'm like, well, tell me about Winston Churchill. And he just starts, but then it turns into this whole book. It's very, like, that part where like, well, he's not as stupid as he seems, feels personal to me, like we are talking. And it works to draw you in. I swear by the end, I get sad at the end of these three books because, Winston Churchill dies because it's a biography. But you start to feel a closeness to this person through these sort of tidbits of funny, tidbits of emotion. I think that's why he does it too. Another thing I have to say about the author is this life is extremely interesting. There are multiple things that could have distracted. By that, I mean, you could write, I don't know how many books about World War II. Winston himself, six books Winston wrote just about World War II. And he was also around for World War I. So this book could have just been obsessively long. And it isn't. It's exactly what you need when you need it. Everything is very Winston Churchill focused. Also, again as a side note, there are books Winston Churchill wrote. He, our author, doesn't take those as gospel because he's a historian and his name's on it. He checks that too. So sometimes we'll have quotes from Winston Churchill saying, I did this on Thursday. Then he cuts in and says what he actually meant was the Wednesday before then, because on that Thursday he couldn't have been there because he was here. That's where that conversation seems to let the narration flow, I would say. He didn't have to have this hard break. He can interject. It makes it feel more personal in both senses. Like he has a hologram of Winston Churchill and we're all talking to it or something. It's very, very cool. It flows very well. Very personal. But that then your author is even checking Winston Churchill. Because he's human and he just writes letters and he might be off a day or two. And for whatever that might be important, it's given that importance and corrected. We have an accurate, to the day almost on spots. He was at this house. He was between these streets. He met his wife on this day. Very, very interesting. You would want a history like this on every major figure, on every major world figure. You just can't have it because in a lot of senses it doesn't exist. I know my boy LBJ is shifty as all get out, so he will lie and hide things. So I'm interested in how these two are going to go, because he will straight not tell you the truth. So how do you, as a historian, get truth out of that? So it's just this wonderful moment in history where we have a guy who just likes to talk and who likes to write and who wrote a lot of his own letters. And it just helps fill out a lot of behind the scenes things. Winston Churchill on taking a test. Oh my God, this was funny. He's trying, okay. So he was going to go to, God, what is it? I don't remember the name of this one college he was going to go to. But because it's Britain, it's something famous like howitzer or something like this, right? It's like the name of a gun or some kind of, I can't remember it right now. In any case, he was trying to get into that school because that's where his dad wanted him to go. He might not have got into it. But then his dad and his brother got into a fight. And so he's like, I don't want my kid going to that school, even though the family always goes to that school. So they ended up trying to get him into Sandhurst. Again, another famous school. And so they sit him down to take a test. And here Winston Churchill's words on test taking. That the inhospitable regions of examination. These were a great trial to me. The subjects which were dearest to the examiners were invariably the ones I fancied least. I should have liked to have been asked what I knew. They always tried to ask what I did not know. Which he thought was just, this isn't fair. You're only asking me stuff I don't know. He sat down to take a test. And this part of the test was to write something in Greek. And his brain just goes blank. He says, I wrote my name, then the number of questions, 1. Later, I put brackets around it. Subsequently, there was a blotch and 2 smudges that came from somewhere. And he sat there staring at that page for 2 hours before the examiner came and just sort of took it. And that was it. He's like, I didn't do well on the test, but I got in anyway. And then of course, the headmaster's like, if he were anyone else other than his dad's son who was in Parliament, he wouldn't be getting in here. But he is, so we're letting him in. Now, Sandhurst, this is where some of the bank history becomes important. Sandhurst, it's a military school, infantry, I think. But back in those days, because who we're expecting to go in, it just becomes the social norm that you pay for everything. So you send a kid, and a bunch of other rich people are sending kids. And those kids all have horses. So Winston wants a horse, but his dad don't want to pay for him a horse because crap's expensive. And he's a little tight on money. But you start to see this dynamic of how they're treating these people. You got to furnish your own room. You hire someone to blacken your own boots. You keep your own horse. It's all you. It's all on you. And internally, now these are all people you know. Those friends you're hanging out with are going to grow up to be in charge of various pieces of the government, whether it be governorship here, mayor there, Secretary of Defense, etc. That's who becomes it. Just literally these people. And so, if you're sitting there and you're broke, you grow up and you're like, he's always been broke. Don't trust him with that. He's kind of cheap. He knows how to act. It's an odd dynamic to build a government with. This weird social circle. It's very interesting. And the army, just so you know, he joined Queen Victoria's army that, according to the author, hadn't changed much since Waterloo, since it fought Napoleon. And that there were still some cats in the army who remember the fight. This is the time frame we're dealing with. It sounds wild to me for some reason. I always, in my mind, put every historical event just miles from any other, but they're not. They're like real tight up in there. And this social dynamic bleeds 100% into the army. I think Wellington very much believed in the fact that only like aristocrats should be officers. So he might have a small number for just a giant army, but he wouldn't pick anyone not an aristocrat to be an officer. Period. End of discussion. He's like, if you don't have some stake in it, you're not going to do as good. It worked for him for a long time. And then in this section, you get a great inside look into that, into the benefits, the negatives. There were cats who sat around whose whole almost obsession was just to look through family trees and make sure someone of a lower class didn't worm their way into an officership. And it's an empire at this time. They have Cuba, India, some of the Caribbean islands, I think Australia, I think some of North Africa, like Iran, this area. They own huge chunks, but no matter how good you did, they weren't going to let some Indian come to Britain and be, in the power group. It just wasn't going to happen. You can stay in India. They even looked down at, like, I'm British, my mom's British, and we were sent to India to govern it, and then I was born there. They kind of look sideways at that cat, too. They're very much about this. And they also, and Winston Churchill, again, this shows up later in life when the wars start actually happening. That era made a point to be just weirdly, obsessively brave. So there are reports of battles where like a cavalry unit's cut off, and literally every one of them, now they're all rich, they're all the sons of rich people. Every one of them had a horse. Every one of them could have turned and YOLO'd out of there. And instead, knowing they don't have a chance to win, they just sort of stay and all die. That's what you do. There's gunfire going out. You have to purposefully stand up in it to show you're not scared of it. If you take a round to the arm, you're just supposed to go, almost like baseball. You're like, ow, well, that kind of stings. Even though your arm's blown off or something. This kind of stories pop up a lot. And Winston was born in a lot of senses like the last of those. I think that's why he called it the last lion. He's the last of the cats of that Victorian age. And then the world starts changing around him in these interesting ways. And you see that he loves it. He loves the empire. He loves the way it functions. And he constantly is thinking of it and fighting for it. Even as, of course, it degrades around him. Now, to this end, he graduates Sandhurst at like 18 or 17. Young guy. I don't remember exactly how old he was. He graduates. And they're like, okay, you can just go on vacation. Now, from their perspective, what you're supposed to do socially is find a war because you're a soldier. You find a war, you go get in it. Some of them lied to get into like a Turkish war. So they're like, he went MIA. They thought he was just in Monte Carlo. And he turns up fighting for the Turks against the Russians. They would find a fight. So that's what Winston tried to do. And you see early on, he has it in his mind that politics is where he's going to end up. And he acts accordingly. His dad had tried to be prime minister, failed horribly, and then later died of syphilis when he was sort of young. So he always had in his mind, finish what my dad started. Also, he has to overcome socially the failure that was his dad in trying for a seat and not getting it. They hold grudges. Again, it's that social dynamic. It makes for very interesting cross paths. In any case, he couldn't find a division to get into quick enough. There would have been one, but he had to wait months. So he decided to go work for a newspaper, and then be sent as a journalist, and then basically act like a soldier journalist, if that makes sense. Because He went to Cuba. He'd go to India. I think he fought in Sudan and South Africa. I forget which one he got captured in. I think in South Africa. In any case, you get lots of just great first-hand account descriptions from him of wars. And by his own admission, he enjoyed it. It was exhilarating to him. He killed dudes. Dudes tried to kill him. It was war. It's war, but he was excited. And what is it? He describes it sort of like you would describe rugby. Like a rough, no rules rugby. And you're really having fun. Some of the funnest reading in it. And that's what he would go. He's supposed to be a reporter. But then the crap hits the fan. And as a British gentleman, he can't just sit and watch as a reporter's supposed to do. So he'll pick up a gun and just start fighting. He is a trained officer. And then he'll go back to being a reporter. So he ended up in this weird quasi, are you a reporter or are you a soldier situation? And it kind of got some cats mad. Because you're like, he's getting more exposure than other people. And sort of at the expense of some of these people. Because as a reporter, if he sees something wrong, he'll say something. Whereas as a soldier, he might have not said it. But he goes ahead and says it because he understands that'll get me more play. It gets more interest, more eyes on me. It helped me in Parliament. And this was the line he would cross. It's just fun to watch him maneuver through politics like this. I think I read it right. I think they said he, at some point, like he's 33 or 32 or something. He's older now. He's trying to get married. But he's from the Victorian age. And so he got no kind of game. All the new dating rules he doesn't know. And so he's just very awkward or stiff or standoffish around women. I think at some point he tried to marry Ethel Barrymore. I believe it's of the Barrymores. Which, I'm like, that's just interesting. That happens a lot in this book. Just interesting interactions with people. He eventually meets and marries Clementine, who is weirdly a lot like him. And that's a weird mix to have too, because you have to be, Victorian in the way you think, but modern. I mean, Victorian in the way you act, but maybe modern in the way you think. Otherwise, you're overrun by Winston Churchill. Instead, he found like an equal, a person he can see eye to eye with. And just a great romance now for the next 60 years he lives or whatever. They constantly wrote each other love letters. You can see the friendship between them. It's very fun. In a lot of other senses, he is a chauvinist, but that's what men in the Victorian age were. And it's like your movie caricature chauvinist. Like he'd bluntly say stuff like women shouldn't be out of the kitchen. Like almost like a joke level. Very funny. But it's the way he thought. He was also horribly racist. And it wasn't that hidden. But again, when you look back at the history at the time, that wasn't unusual either. Just as a side note, the anti-Jew sort of sentiment wasn't what people hated the Nazis for in the moment. That came after. Very wild to see how societies change. He becomes Lord of the Admiralty. That is a cabinet position. It's very high up. You're sitting there talking to the King of England. Edward, I think, at the time. And he is this Lord of the Admiralty when World War I first starts. He has all kind of ideas. I think they say he spearheaded tanks as a concept. But he said he wanted his land battleships. So this section of the book, and it's glorious. It's firsthand accounts not of battles almost, but from a political side of, Dunkirk, Antwerp, etc., etc. You name the famous battle, he was involved somehow because he was sitting right in that seat, running all the boats, all the naval anything for Britain. I think, what is it? The Dardanelles operation. I'm not going to go all into it. Again, I think I have, and I haven't read it yet. I have a whole book just on this one operation. And it's just a piece of Winston Churchill's life. Just a whole book on it. It goes south. It's not good. But there's a lot of not good in the war. But someone's got to take the blame. And they pin it on Winston, essentially. He becomes the public sort of scapegoat. And he loses the admiralty. He's out. He then is out or leaves Parliament and wants a commission in the army. And he wants to go to the front. He wants a division. He's qualified for it, unlike a lot of other people. A lot are just rich kids, sons of rich dudes. That's their whole qualification. He's seen combat in multiple places, including the current Germans, and he's written multiple books about strategy. So he's clearly, but they don't give it to him because of politics. And that's a lot. Got a good chunk of this book is backdoor, behind the scenes politics. So again, if that's not fun for you, you might not like it. But if you don't typically like politics in a book, you might give this one a try because it's still kind of fun. The personal element that you get between the author and Winston really lets you feel more of what politics can bring. Not just he tricked me, but like the betrayal of the tricking. Very fun. It's very fun. And again, he is rich. He doesn't have to do this. He purposefully walks the fence, the line in the front. German guns shooting at him. He'll happily report when a artillery shell doinks off the roof of the shed he's in eating lunch. And it, puts shrapnel everywhere, but luckily doesn't blow. He thinks a lot like Napoleon thought. I think he mentions this at some point, where Napoleon said, if fate's with you, you might as well lean on her. He thinks a lot in the same ways, where if you're destined in any sense, then it almost doesn't matter. So you don't have to be afraid that you're gonna trip on something and just avoid death. And he does, like, multiple times here. I think at some point, like, someone stole this bunk and that guy blows up. Or that guy, he's like, you're kind of fat, but you wanted to go eat breakfast early, and then our tent blew up. So, I'm thankful that your fat butt was hungry so that we could go eat. This kind of energy happens. And the humor and the nonchalantness that Winston Churchill has just makes for just some of the most glorious history you can read. And of course, if you are a World War I sort of fan, this is a must read. Just for that section alone, must read. It will be the same with World War II when he gets to it, because he does live through it too. But it's not in this book. And, in this book, he's now, he's out of power, but he has power's ear. So he'll make a lot of suggestions. Again, sort of the spearhead of the tank. He wants aggressive movements. He doesn't want to sit and linger. And you see, it's all part of World War I, where that Victorian age thinking really just squandered just hundreds of thousands of dudes' lives. It's its own separate story, but it's wild. It's absolutely wild. And you sort of get from his perspective, what you get. is this weird line you have to walk as a politician. So he was on the front and he understood what was happening. And he didn't like it. He's like, this is stupid. We don't have enough guys to move forward to a place that's any kind of benefit to us. I can get 30, 100, 200 yards, but what's that dirt different than this one? And it'll cost me 100,000 guys to get that far. And then in 2 weeks, I'll lose some coming back and we'll be right back here. So there's no point to move anywhere until we can gather enough dudes to make one big push and get this over with. But if you didn't want to do peace already, which he wasn't about peace, but he understood that. But the generals in charge, Haig and some of the others, were just adamant on you just grind at it. And they were just grinding dudes to death. It's very wild. So you would think, as a politician, he would be vocally against that. But that wasn't the sentiment at the time. The sentiment at home, where the votes are that these are war heroes. Everyone in the military high echelon is a war hero. And so vocally, he was pro them because that's what you do politically. He does this a lot throughout the book. Somehow you don't hate him for it. You would think it's two-faced, but he's not actually. He just can leave things where they belong. So if we're friends, we can be friends. If our friendship starts hurting my politics, we can't be friends. But that's not a true friendship. I mean, it is. He's not going to abandon you. If he can help you get a new position, a new situation, and move you forward, yeah, I'll do that. But he's not going to sacrifice limbs for you. He understands that he needs the power to make decisions that help more than one person. It's this weird line he can just waltz through that very few can. Usually gets too personal and you just hate a guy or love a guy. He maneuvers through it very slickly. And just on the maneuvers alone of politics, it's fun. It's very fun to watch. After the war, he's very much against harshly punishing Germany, but everyone else wants to harshly punish Germany. To what effect we know is the Nazi Party and very bad things. This is another side note. Just as on racism. Who's the president? Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson wanted the League of Nations. Japan wanted a clause in the League of Nations. You know what the clause said? Japan wanted a clause that said, all races are essentially equal. Sort of the Australians, as part of the British Commonwealth, were the ones who finally defeated this clause. We cannot say in the League of Nations that all races are basically equal. Just so you know, the levels of racism we were dealing with way back in the day. 1914, 1918-ish. This is what it looked like. It was very real. Wild. Winston Churchill wanted Gandhi arrested and everyone who followed Gandhi to be shipped out of the country to some other part of the Commonwealth. That's how he would have handled it. He fought. He watched people not love his empire as much as he did. His being the British Empire. He sort of watched it slowly get taken away from him. He fought against it, but it was, again, a losing fight. Nothing he can do. The book ends with, I think he's out of politics for a while. He writes books, sort of famous, or starting to get more famous. And he goes to him. He's in America. I think his mom moved to America, so he's half visiting her, half doing tours for some books or things like this. And again, between not being used to street lights, because those were in New York at the time and not in London, and not remembering that Americans drive on the other side of the road, he steps into the street thinking it's clear, gets hit by a car at 35, which not incredibly fast, but You know, the cars were made of brick. Brick back then. He got hit, drug, yeeted through the air. He's calming the guy who hit him down. Like, no, it's okay. It's my fault. His cuts on his legs, on his head. They run him to a hospital. What hospital? Lenox Hill Hospital. Private hospital. He wanted, I think he said chloroform to numb the pain. They wouldn't give him any until they, you know, get more of a sense of how he's going to pay. Which, again, is wild. America now just patches people up. But then, I guess, it was different. And that's how this book ends, with him sort of in the hospital, getting ready to write this up. And, you know, your Nazi element cooking in the background. It's a big fat book. And I say fat as in dense in detail. Of course, I'm not going to cover every little bit. It'd be impossible. It's just impossible. Those are the big points to me, that you get a sense of the Victorian age, a sense of British politics, and a good sense of World War I. It's a lot for one book. Highly recommend this. Highly recommend this to anyone who likes good stories. Winston Churchill's a character by himself. There's 10,000 just fun quotes, just every other page almost. He's so fun. Okay. Part 1 of The Last Lion. We got 2 more to do, people. Ad time? These are your boys' books. I wrote them. You can buy them for money. You get Kindle Unlimited and read them. And then you won't own them. But then I'll get some money Spotify style. Spotify book style. That's what you got to think of Kindle Unlimited as. Is Kindle Unlimited paying me? No. Will I accept Amazon money? Yes. So if you're Jeff Bezos listening to this, you know, send me the old checkaroo. Okay, people. I'll talk to you all next week.